Thank you very much, Chief of Staff, Chief of Defense Staff, Commander of the Army, Commander of the Navy, the Chief of the Civil Defense Force, and also the Chief of the Coast Guard. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Let me share my own views very briefly on the defeat of terrorism and the restoration of stability and security in Sri Lanka before I make comments that are specific to the defense seminar. There are two aspects that come to my mind as I examined global conflicts at the beginning of this century and at the end of the last century. Malaya or Malaysia became the only country towards the end of the last century to defeat an insurgency. The architect of that defeat was General Gerald Templer. In fact, some of the Sri Lankans here will recall that there's a Templar Road in Mount Lavinia which is named in honor of that general. His director of operations was Richard Clutterbuck, General Richard Clutterbuck, and he came to Sri Lanka when President Jayawardena was in office and advised the Sri Lankan president that the JVP can be dismantled if the leadership is isolated and eliminated. So he identified the center of gravity of the terrorist group called the JVP as the leadership. And likewise, in the fight against the LTT, the leadership was the most crucial dimension. Sri Lanka defeated the first insurgency and terrorist group in the 21st century. In the coming years, there will be many other terrorist and insurgent groups that may be defeated, because the lessons of Sri Lanka today, forums such as the defense seminar continues to share with other countries. I would also like to share with you that the Sri Lankan campaign entailed three elements after the defeat of the LTT. One was humanitarian assistance, second was socio-economic development, and third was political engagement. Let me share with you that if you look at the Western war manuals, the American manuals including, they say that long after conflicts end, long after the fighting ends, there must be the security layer, security platform must continue. In fact, I want to share with you that one of the failures of Western intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan is that that security layer could not be continued. But in Sri Lanka, I must share with you that soon after the defeat of the LTT, the security forces did not withdraw from the north and the east. The militaries transformed very rapidly into a development army. And that is why it was possible to provide very rapidly the humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance consisted of three components. One is receiving 383,000 IDPs, creation of those welfare centers. Second was the rehabilitation of 12,000 LTT cadres. And the third component was very quickly to demine. Nearly 1.5 million mines were removed from the LTT controlled areas. And all these three are unprecedented. In fact, US counterinsurgency advisor who traveled with me soon after the first defense seminar to Vaunia, he remarked that what Bosnia took 10 years, Sri Lanka had accomplished in 2 years. I believe it is because the government made a very deliberate decision that there was a capable military organization. And this military organization will continue to provide that key assistance. Civilian infrastructure, ladies and gentlemen, was destroyed. In fact, I myself appealed to the Secretary of Defense at that point to appoint a military officer to head the post of Commissioner General of Rehabilitation. Because we had a civilian heading that post. He was the Secretary of Justice. The Secretary of Defense of Sri Lanka, he understood the importance of having a military officer, because a military officer was able to requisition vehicles, to bring in the physical infrastructure that was necessary to house those detainees, to feed those detainees. Civilian organization was not able to do it. It would have taken a long time. So this theory that we must use civilian infrastructure in a war zone as soon as the conflict ended really does not hold ground. There was a lot of criticism of the Sri Lankan military at that point, but the military prevailed and they continue to render this human assistance. And I also want to tell you that the 283,000 IDPs, they were very rapidly resettled. One of the greatest success of Sri Lanka's story, why terrorism did not return back to Sri Lanka, but it returned in the case of Iraq and in the case of Afghanistan, is that Sri Lanka built a world-class terrorist rehabilitation program. This entailed religious and spiritual rehabilitation. I want to share with you that those detainees who were identified as rehabilitees or beneficiaries, as they were called in the Sri Lankan context, they meditated. They built inner peace, inner harmony. The second aspect was educational rehabilitation. LTT was a very illiterate organization. They went to school. Nearly 500 children who were members of the LTT were educated at Ratmalana Hindu College, a very prestigious school in Colombo. They were treated as children, not as child combatants. I also want to share with you that the private companies of Sri Lanka, the private firms, very resilient companies, they came forward and provided the vocational training component. We also had recreational rehabilitation. The military officers I saw, they gave their bats, their sports equipment to their adversaries of the past. And this is unprecedented. I've worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, visited and worked inside Camp Cropper and camp in Afghanistan, including their high-value detention centers. The type of bond that was built between the detainee and the soldier did not exist in those countries. In fact, on Christmas Day in 2009, I was in Vaunia at the Poontotam terrorist rehabilitation camp. And on that day, USAID was providing food, and the food abruptly stopped. Then General Dayaratnaka was the Commissioner General of Rehabilitation. And I recall very rapidly the Sri Lanka Army provided their ration packs to the LTT cadres. There was tremendous friendship between the cadre and the soldier. They all came from nearly the same social background. So I want to share with you that through the mediums of song, dance, puppetry, creative arts, performance arts, these people, their hatred was replaced with love. They rejected violence and embraced peace. The way the former LTT cadres were treated, in many ways stabilized that environment. I also want to share with you that the socio-economic development of the Northeast was unprecedented. North grew at 27% when the GDP, the rest of the country was 7%. No one in the south of Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese complained about it. The Muslims didn't complain about it. Why is it? It is because Sri Lanka is a land where there is perfect social harmony between the Sinhalese, Tamils and the Muslims. This social harmony, ladies and gentlemen, has been disrupted by our political leaders, both in the south and in the north, because our political leaders ethnicized the Sri Lankan population to think as Sinhalese, to think as Muslims, and to think as Tamils. If you look at the most recent election manifesto of the TNA, an avatar of the LTT, the latest reincarnation of the LTT, is again moving towards a separatist ideology. So I want to say that it is so important today to protect and to immunize our populations, to make them resilient towards political ideals of those divisions. Average Sinhalese, average Tamil, average Muslim has nothing against their brothers and sisters. So Sri Lanka will continue to face many challenges, but the greatest challenge it faced was terrorism, was insurgency. And the LTT defeat is a great moral achievement, not only for the Sri Lankan military forces, but for the Sri Lankan people, because they suffered a lot. All communities suffered. In fact, our brothers and sisters in the north suffered more than our brothers and sisters in the south. But certainly, the Sinhalese also suffered. All our iconic targets were attacked. Our airport, our most sacred temple, the Dalada Maligava, another great religious sanctuary, which is Anuradhapura, where the Sri Mahabodhi is, our central bank, our World Trade Center, all these iconic targets were attacked. One president was killed, another president was nearly killed. Number of our generals were killed. So it was a huge conflict. But the military, working with the intelligence services, working with the police, working with the other agencies of government, was able to defeat terrorism. And if you look at the proceedings of the last 2.5 days, it very clearly reflected how the military was able to transform from a war-fighting army into a development army. Today, the Sri Lankan security forces commanders located in the north and the east, engaging in reconciliation, promoting moderation, promoting toleration, promoting the values of coexistence, which we had in our bones, in our blood, but we lost it for a short period of time in our history. It is because there was no real effort in nation building immediately after independence. And today, there's a great effort that is being put to unite these communities. The conference also highlighted a few contentious issues. And I think it is very important for me to share with you my own views on some of those issues. One is there was a reference by Professor Krauss from the University of Kiel about EU views. I want to share with you that the EU views, the views of the European community, some segments of EU, that we had very large-scale civilian fatalities and casualties, that is not true. I want to share with you that there's an internal UN report that estimated the figures at 7,000. And I also want to share with you that of that 7,000, about 4,500 to 5,000 people who died, they were LTT cadres. Another 2,000 that died were civilians. I would say that the total number of civilians that died from January to May of 2009 will not exceed 3,000. Most likely it was around 2,000. Anyone who suggests that there were large-scale civilian killings should come up with a list of names. And no one has come up with such a list of names. And the census that have been conducted very clearly indicates the number of fatalities of the last phase. And I also want to share with you that this narrative of Sri Lanka is largely being developed by the LTT front and cover and sympathetic organizations overseas, and also non-governmental organizations that are funded or have links with those LTT fronts, or NGO organizations that have been misguided, that have not conducted their field work in the north and the east of Sri Lanka. I also want to share with you that the Sri Lankan government failed miserably in one component. And this is a very important lesson for all of you as you move forward to tackle your own insurgencies and terrorist campaigns. The Sri Lankan government never emphasized on strategic communication. Had the Sri Lankan military had a strategic communications division, had the Sri Lankan Ministry of External Affairs had a division on strategic communication, I believe that these allegations would have been countered. This is Sri Lanka's weakness. Because the Sri Lankan military and the Sri Lankan political leadership focused internally on defeating an insurgency and a terrorist campaign, it did not focus on the criticism from overseas. That also had advantage. That is, when the foreign minister of the UK and the foreign minister of France came on the eve of the defeat of the LTT and told the Sri Lankan government, you must stop this military campaign. Sri Lankan president, Sri Lankan Secretary of Defense considered their request as an interference in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka. Those ministers returned back to Britain and France. And within a few days, the Sri Lankan military was able very successfully to terminate the conflict by dismantling the LTT and decapitating the leadership of the LTT. So sometimes it is very important to pursue your core interests, your national interests, the interests that reflect the will of the people. I believe that the Sri Lankan conflict protracted for 30 years because of interference. We had so much of interference from overseas. As Dr. Subramaniam Swami said, we had succumbed to that interference. Norway. We also had very significant interference during a certain period of time from India. That is from 1983 to 1987. And I hope that I will very briefly share with you that the Sri Lankan conflict always had a geopolitical and a geostrategic dimension, as many of the speakers shared with us. And this is something that Sri Lanka must be very cautious as we move forward. We must not get too close to China. We must not get too close to India. We must not get too close to the West. We must pursue our national and our core interests. There was a time from 1983 to 1987, the government of India supported the insurgency and the terrorist campaign in Sri Lanka. The first batch of Tamil Tigers were trained in Establishment 22 in Chakrata, north of Dehradun, in Uttar Pradesh. Second batch was trained in Himachal Pradesh. 8 other batches, including the batch in Tindugal in Tamil Nadu, where Tenmuli Rajaratnam, known as Danu, who killed Rajiv Gandhi, was trained in Tindugal. So I want to share with you, at that time, the Indian government agencies supported the LTT and other terrorist groups because Sri Lanka had drifted away and become very close to the Western nations. In fact, our President Jayawardena, was called Yankee Dicky. He's very close to the Americans. So the Indians perceived that there was a build-up on its southern doorstep in Sri Lanka. Similarly, as we move forward, it is paramount that we pursue our core interests. Had we remained non-aligned, I believe that today Sri Lanka would have been far ahead of South Asia. We would have been like a Dubai or a Singapore or a Hong Kong. Because traditionally, the socio-economic indices of this country has been far ahead of India, Pakistan, of Maldives, of Bangladesh, and of Nepal. We are a very small country. We had free education. We had a visionary leader who did that. And also, we are very strategically positioned. So I believe that very soon, Sri Lanka will move forward from a middle economy to an advanced economy. But for this, it is essential that we restore our relations with those countries that have some differences, and those differences were inevitable because we pursued our core interests to defeat terrorism and insurgency. And also, I want to share with you that as Sri Lanka moves forward, it is paramount to have a Harmony Act, because one of the greatest challenges future Sri Lanka will face is from ethnic and religious extremism. This is a challenge not only for Sri Lanka but for the entire region. So we cannot divide Sri Lanka by ethnic regions or religious regions. Sri Lanka will be a country where Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims will live wherever they want and live together harmoniously. We will not model ourselves on India or any other country. I also want to share with you that the idea of having ethno-linguistic states is an ancient idea. It is an idea not for the future. If you look at the global cities, people of different ethnic and religious hues, they live together. So the future is in creating nations where people have greater understanding, greater respect for those cultural differences. And in that sense, Sri Lanka will create that one nation, one Sri Lanka that is essential to persist. Let me conclude by saying that Sri Lanka still faces some challenges on the security side, as the Secretary of Defense mentioned. LTT organization still has some networks overseas. But I want to share with you that less than 10% of the Sri Lankan Tamil community overseas, the expatriate community, support the LTT. They themselves have traveled to Sri Lanka. Every plane that I take to this country, 50% of the flight is full of Sri Lankan Tamils. When they come and they see the development in the northeast, they go back and say that you are living in a frozen bubble. When you came back, the memory you had of Sri Lanka. And today Sri Lanka itself has progressed, but you have not. So they've taken a very positive message to the expatriate Sri Lankans. I also want to share with you that there are 4 fronts that pose a challenge to Sri Lanka. One is the transnational government of Tamil Eelam, led by Rudrakumar in New York. Other is the Nediyavan faction, based in Norway, in Oslo. Other is the Vinayagam group, which is in Paris, the headquarters group. And the other is the Global Tamil Forum, led by S.J. Emmanuel, Father Emmanuel, in London. Government of Sri Lanka today is even willing to talk to those groups. And I want to share with you that has been the spirit of the Sri Lankan state. Even the man who headed the LTT International Network, Selvarasa Padmanathan, known as Kumaran Padmanathan, when he came to Sri Lanka, he was deported from Malaysia, And since he was brought to Sri Lanka, he himself is engaging in activities to do with harmony. And we have a number of LTT leaders, including a minister who was a former child combatant. So you can see the far-reaching steps Sri Lanka has taken to reach out to those organizations and to those individuals. Because Sri Lanka's key concern is today to restore stability. The model of restorative justice, not one of punitive justice, of prosecutions and of long-term trials. Because this is the spirit of the Sri Lankan people, of forget, forgive, and moving forward. This is a spirit very difficult for our Western friends to understand. And I hope that they will all visit those rehabilitation centers and they will speak to those former cadres of the LTT who were rehabilitated, the beneficiaries, and come to understand the long-term strategic moves the government has taken to restore stability. And I think that was very much reflected not only at this venue at the defense seminar, but as we had at Kingsbury Hotel that evening, where Gokulan, a former LTT cadre, sang songs of peace. Having interviewed Gokulan, having visited his house in the Vanni, I want to share with you that I also met his father. His father sang 400 songs for the LTT. After Tenisa Sellappa, he is one of the most famous singers. And Shantan told me, Gokulan's father who sang these 400 LTT songs said, because of me, many people became black tigers, suicide terrorists. But today Shantan is singing devotional songs, such as Raghupati Raghava Radha Ram Patita Pavan Sita Ram, which is in many ways to say that we all have one God and that we see beyond all those ethnicities. Let me conclude by saying that the commander of the army, General Ratnayaka, today shared with me his intentions of expanding the defense seminar into adding a number of new features. And one is to create 3 learning journeys where you will have the opportunity to travel to Kilinochchi and Jaffna and see the development and the reconciliation activities. For instance, in Kilinochchi, a very beautiful harmony center has been built. The military working very closely with the civilians. And I myself, having visited Kilinochchi day before yesterday, I was amazed to see those platforms created by very visionary military leaders. Second is a visit to Batiklo and Trincomalee, highlighting development and coexistence, because the East is a symbol of where Tamils, Muslims and Sinhalese live together. And third is a visit to the South, Galle and Hambantota, to see development and maritime affairs. I also want to share with you that the summary of the critique that was made by each one of you has been tabulated, and there are 5 fields of question. The first question is, are you satisfied with the travel arrangements? 81% said highly satisfied, 14% said satisfied, and 3% said unsatisfied. Are you satisfied with the arrangements for accommodation arrangements? 85% said highly satisfied, 14% said satisfied, and 0% said unsatisfied. Do you think conducted sessions were relevant to seminar theme? The theme being post-conflict Sri Lanka challenges and regional stability. 74% said very relevant, 25% said relevant, and 0% said irrelevant. Do you think the conduct of sessions were logical and progressive? 100% said logical and progressive. Are you satisfied with inputs received from the seminar sessions? 74% said well satisfied, 25% said satisfied, and 0% said unsatisfied. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude delivering my address at this event of great prestige and of honor, let me pay my own tribute to Sri Lankan military personnel and Sri Lankan service personnel that sacrificed their lives, their time towards restoring stability and security in this country. And in saying so, I should say that those military personnel who are here are very fortunate, because there are many of our friends, many of our brothers and sisters and our extended family who have perished. And I recall my own classmate for 10 years was Lieutenant Rohan Gunaratna. And he was the first army officer to be killed in the LTT campaign. He died as he led 44 Bravo Patrol in Jaffna in July of 1983. But I am not the only one. Many of you have suffered. And I want to share with you that future generations of Sri Lankans will be grateful for the military officers that fought and ended terrorism. And as you move forward, I ask you that to prevent the setting of ideological extremism, because terrorism is a byproduct of ideological extremism. And we all have to challenge the return of those extremist forces. I mentioned the avatar. We may have defeated terrorism and insurgency, but we should ensure that particular ideological virus does not manifest itself in a political form, where we will have to fight in the future another terrorist or a terrorist campaign or insurgency. So as we move forward, we should exercise maximum vigilance and build the necessary laws and the norms and the values necessary to protect Sri Lanka. Once again, let me thank each one of you for your contribution. And we will always remain in debt and gratitude. And we will always have in our memories those soldiers, those officers, those men and those women that fought and died to restore peace and harmony in this land of Sri Lanka. Thank you.